There is no peace without women.
My name is Anne Carr, and I'm a volunteer facilitator and board member for Community Dialogue.
Reflecting back on the early 80s and through the signing of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, what was it like for women to hold communities together during times of conflict and tension?
It certainly wasn't easy. We know that. 1969 for me was the beginning of something that I never expected in my life. And when I look back at that now, I'm now 72 and look back to those years, I'm probably part of a very small number of women now who remember those days. So when the conflict started, I had been working, I worked in the civil service. I left school at 15 and managed to get a job as a clerical officer in the civil service. So it was the first time really that I met women from across the community because I come from the Greater Shankill area. And that for me was wonderful. So when 69 meant that the bombing started, the shooting started, our lives became very unstable and crazy, and fear levels were really, really high. We had to take a breath, take a beat, and decide how we were going to cope with this. So, for me, it became a time of finding coping strategies, and that's what women did. And that's what women in communities did. Women knew very quickly that they were going to have to maybe take on the role of mum and dad, because it wasn't long into the Troubles that the men started to go to prison. Mostly men started to go to prison. So we ended up with communities for the first time being led by women who before that had been at home looking after their children. But they had to take on very many different roles, first and foremost to try and keep their children safe. And that wasn't easy when they didn't know when their children went out, particularly teenagers. They weren't going to run into some of this everyday violence. So they became everyday peacebuilders. And they worked together. And that was crucial. There was a huge movement at that time of people. I lived in Belfast, but from across Belfast, because it wasn't safe to live in what was known as mixed areas. So people found themselves moving to areas where they felt safer. And you saw the beginning of the barriers going up. You saw the peace walls, as they're known now, starting to be built to actually keep communities apart, because it was felt that for people to live their lives in the middle of this conflict, that it was safer. But it made it very difficult for women who had always managed to come together to find ways of keeping their relationships going. But women, being women, did. I just loved to get out to communities of women, to hear them talk about the difficulties they were having. And when we managed to bring them together, and we did through the organisation Women Together that I worked for, and the Women's Information Group, when I look back to those days, to make sure that women could come together when it was so difficult to do so, and to learn from one another about how best to keep themselves safe, their families safe, to keep communities actually functioning, meant that they had to learn new skills. They had to have information. They had to know what was going on outside their community as well as inside, because of the barriers and the fact that they couldn't actually, for many of them, look across the wall. Sometimes their own community became a very unsafe space, and they felt that, those that lived across the wall were going to attack them in some way. But by keeping the communications open across those divides, and by even using systems like the telephone systems that eventually came into place so that we could talk to one another across the divides, and women were crucial to those systems, it meant that you could keep the levels of fear low within your community and stop panic that could happen very, very easily and quickly. So providing those opportunities for women, as difficult as it was important. And even for the women who took part in our conversations that we organised at that time, and travelled across, sometimes in buses and across community divisions that were difficult to manoeuvre. We did it, and we created safe enough spaces for women to actually sit down together, talk to one another, hear one another, learn from one another, get information from all sorts of sources, which helped us understand what actually was going on in the bigger picture, because our pictures sometimes became very small. And through that type of working and the strength and stamina and determination of women, that, you know, that they would keep societies together, we would work to end the violence, and we would come out the other end stronger, was really important.
In order to step forward to become a peace builder and a women's leader, how does someone get to that point? What advice would you give, and what risks did you take?
You know something, I think when you have suffered through the sort of conflict that we were experiencing, you get a drive that never goes away, because you never want other people to experience what you experienced. You know, we had to leave Northern Ireland for a year, because my group of friends, before, just when the conflict broke out, was from across the community. But one of them was targeted for death, simply because he was a Catholic living in a mostly Protestant area. And at that time in 1972, it was the way of things. You know, tit for tat killings were, and if you were an easy target, sometimes you became that target. We decided we would leave Northern Ireland for a year because of that. We'd had enough. We had seen enough. We needed to be somewhere where we didn't have this sort of extra pressure of never knowing whether we would survive the day. So we went to London for a year, and that very person who had been targeted, I married him while we were in London. And we got married in a registry office in London with none of our family members present, just our few friends, because I was from the Protestant Shankill Road area of Belfast, and he was a Catholic. So that in itself, a year later deciding to come home and make our home in Northern Ireland in the middle of the conflict in 1973, with no money and no home, and having to find somewhere safe to live, meant that we ended up living in Antrim for a few years, and then eventually going to live in Newcastle, because they were safer spaces. And we wouldn't have felt safe living in Belfast, where my family lived. That really set me on a path. I didn't want anybody else to go through that. I didn't want any other family to go through that fear, because the reality is we lived with a baseball bat under our bed for 20 years, because, you know, my husband felt that those same people were out there and they would try to target him and get him. That's the trauma of the conflict. That's what lives on today. That's the widespread trauma that we haven't really done enough to deal with even today. I worked with women, as I said, in those early years, and interestingly enough, pre the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, in those years when we campaigned consistently to end the violence and worked hard to provide whatever support we could for those who had been injured and bereaved in the conflict, remembering that there was no official support in those early years at all. I mean, when I worked for Women Together, we realised very quickly that it was only a little bit of community support that was available. So we managed to get a working group together to look at what was available. We did a mapping exercise in those early years, finding that it was really only community support. We then worked with Marion Gibson of Victim Support, who was the chair of Victim Support then. And through that process, and her having contacts at more official levels, came the Bloomfield process, and from the Bloomfield process came the understanding of the great need that was out there. And then eventually we got the Victims Commissioner. Actually, we started off with 4, but now 1 Victims Commissioner. But we started, I think, an understanding that there was an official process needed, that people needed much more support than was available to them. And I'm very proud of the fact that we worked in those early years to, in some ways, make that happen. Women were crucial to the ending of the violence, the peace talks that then came about for 2 years, and in ensuring that the Belfast Good Friday Agreement happened. Without women, I honestly believe it wouldn't have happened, because women were organized very quickly. And I'm going to talk about the Women's Coalition here because I got involved with the Women's Coalition, but there were women in other political parties as well. But when we managed to get the ceasefires, and that in itself was years and years and years of campaigning, but when they happened for me, it was, the beginning. We can actually move forward. And then when the government announced that they were going to have peace talks and that they had decided to create what was known as a list system to make sure that 10 groupings were around the table, and that was to make sure that the widest possible group of people from across the community were there at the peace talks. Women saw an opportunity because they knew that they had to be at that peace talks table. There's no point, and I had worked with women for many years, saying to them, "It's great that we do what we do in the community, but really we need to be at the decision-making tables too." And the only way we're going to do that is if we actually find within us our leadership qualities, which we all have. I mean, I left school at 15, as I said. I mean, my community work was my route to becoming a leader and deciding that I could take responsibilities that I never thought I would be able to take. So the mobilization of women to ensure that there were 2 women at the peace talks was really, really important. And, sometimes we think that the Women's Coalition was more a middle class grouping, but it was the women in ordinary communities that actually came together. And when they understood the importance of having two women at the peace talks, then they, mobilized and made sure that we got enough votes to be one of those 10 groupings and be at the table. So it was really, really important for women to be there. That was understood. And that was only the beginning, because once we got women to the talks table, it was really important that then those women that were there were engaging with the very extensive women's networks that were out within communities at that time. And it wasn't only Belfast, it was right across. We managed to engage women from right across. So women crucial to the peace talks, women crucial to be the those who managed to keep other groupings in the room. Because you must remember that George Mitchell said in all of those 2 years there was one good day, and that was the day that the agreement was signed. Because throughout that process, unless we could create opportunities for people to see that yes, they were what their needs were going to be met within these peace talks, and they were going to be met within whatever agreement we come up with, it would be a compromise at the end of the day. But it was the women that kept them there. It was the women with that drive. It was the women who wanted their children to know something better. They had worked for years to get this peace agreement idea, and the peace talks were the route. But at the very core and basis of everything I have done throughout my life has been the need for us to build a society based on love and trust and understanding of one another, where we can live together, work together, play together, be together, and thrive together.
Looking forward, what support for women and from women is needed for the ongoing peace process?
Well, the reality is that, it's 26 years now since the signing of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. We never had a proper implementation process, for a start. Our government has been up and down several times, and 26 years later we have never seen peace and reconciliation at the heart of our society seen as important, valued, and crucial to moving forward together. So that's where we are today. And it's really, really important that women acknowledge that and, work together. Because what we don't need is women working in silos, because we have a society that works in silos. And nothing works better than women who come together with all their various skills, with their lived experiences, which are crucial, with their understanding that together we are stronger. And I see women being that collective, crucial ingredient to moving peace and reconciliation forward in our society, because the cost of division is huge. It was never expected 26 years after the agreement that we would still be in such a divided society, when the focus was not on working with that, changing that, bringing peace and reconciliation to the heart of everything we do, how would we ever move forward to a more shared and just and equal society? So now is the time. We have done our best in these years, and women often felt that they weren't being listened to in these years post Belfast Good Friday Agreement. But I think we're in a good place, and I think we have so much to offer as women. And if we can all come together collectively and work towards that goal of a new, and it is new, shared, just, equitable, human rights driven, where everyone feels a sense of belonging in the society that is Northern Ireland now, which is very different from that 26 years ago. We now have so many different ethnic minority communities who have come and made their home here. So women driving forward that idea of a sense of belonging for all is where we need to go now.